The bank called at 2:47 in the afternoon. A man's voice chilled my spine. "We are calling regarding your home's foreclosure." The problem? I had no mortgage. I bought that house outright with cash. 19 minutes later, I stood in my parents' backyard, staring at a brand new pickup truck and a freshly remodeled kitchen. My father looked right at me and calmly said, "Family is just using what belongs to family. My name is Kennedy Kelly. I am 34 years old. And until exactly 2:47 this afternoon, I thought I had built a life that was entirely bulletproof. I was sitting at my desk at the Southeastern Community Grant Review Bureau in Raleigh, halfway through a tedious stack of municipal funding proposals, when the red voicemail light began to flash on my office phone. It was a rhythmic, angry little blink. I picked up the receiver and punched in my code. The voice on the other end belonged to a representative from a major national bank. His tone was perfectly measured, polite, but carrying the unmistakable chill of corporate finality. He stated he was calling regarding a mortgage payment that was currently 90 days past due. This was, he noted smoothly, a final courtesy warning before the bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings against the property. I stopped breathing. The spreadsheet on my monitor dissolved into a meaningless blur of colors. I live in a 3-bedroom house in the Brook Hollow neighborhood. I purchased that house in the year 2020. I paid for it entirely in cash, using every single dime I had aggressively saved since graduating college. Combined with a modest stock payout from a tech startup I used to work for, there was no mortgage, there was no lender. I owned the walls, the roof, the hardwood floors, and the dirt beneath the foundation absolutely free and clear. My fingers felt numb, almost disconnected from my brain. As I dialed the callback number provided in the message, after a torturous hold time featuring cheerful, soulless, smooth jazz, a representative named Marcus answered the line. My voice was surprisingly steady as I explained the mistake. I gave him my address. I told him I owned my home outright. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clacking of his keyboard through the headset. Then Marcus sighed. It was a short, sharp intake of breath that made my stomach drop. He informed me there was no mistake on their end. According to the screen in front of him, a cash-out refinancing loan for $200,000 had been approved, finalized, and fully dispersed. The paperwork, he explained, had been submitted in person at a local branch office. I pressed the phone harder against my ear, shaking my head. Even though he could not see me, I told him that was fundamentally impossible. I had not set foot inside a physical bank branch in over 3 years. Marcus paused. I could hear the hesitation, the sudden shift from routine customer service to high-alert damage control. He stated that the loan documents had not been signed by me directly. They had been executed by 2 individuals acting under a legally binding power of attorney. I demanded the names. Marcus hesitated again, citing privacy protocols and account security, but my voice dropped an octave. It sharpened into a blade of pure, unadulterated panic. I told him it was my house, my supposed debt, and I demanded the names of the signatories immediately. Marcus cleared his throat and read them out. Patrick Kelly, Maureen Kelly, my father, my mother. I did not argue with Marcus. I did not scream, and I did not ask to speak to a manager or a fraud department. I simply hung up the receiver. I grabbed my car keys from the top drawer of my desk, grabbed my purse, and walked out of the building. I did not tell my supervisor I was leaving early. I did not look at my coworkers. I just moved, propelled by a cold, mechanical shock. The drive from downtown Raleigh to Ashford Grove, the manicured suburb where I grew up, usually takes 45 minutes in afternoon traffic. I made it in under 30. The tires of my sedan hummed a frantic, aggressive rhythm against the asphalt as my mind raced. Desperately trying to assemble puzzle pieces I had been actively ignoring for weeks, I remembered a Sunday dinner a little over a month ago. My mother, Maureen, had been uncharacteristically interested in my home organization. She had casually, almost breezily over dessert, asked where I kept my important documents. She wondered aloud if I had invested in a good fireproof safe. She asked, with a light laugh. If my original house deed was just sitting in some flimsy filing cabinet, at the time, I thought she was just being her usual, overbearing self. Dispensing unsolicited advice to her adult daughter, I had rolled my eyes. I had told her everything was secure. I had told her exactly where the safe was bolted into the floor of my closet. The pit in my stomach deepened, turning sour and heavy. This feeling of impending disaster was not entirely foreign to me. It was the exact same nauseating dread that washed over me every single time my younger brother, Declan, caused a catastrophe. Whether he crashed a car without insurance, racked up 5-figure credit card debt, or got fired from another job for showing up late. My parents always rushed in to cushion his fall, and somehow, the cleanup always magically became my responsibility. The expectations in the Kelly household were unspoken, but carved in stone. Kennedy is the responsible one. Kennedy has savings. Kennedy will fix it. But this was not quietly bailing Declan out of a minor scrape. This was not lending him rent money that I knew I would never see again. This was a violation on a scale I could not fully process. As I merged off the highway, my brain fought a desperate battle to construct a bridge of innocent logic. Maybe it was an elaborate identity theft scheme. Maybe someone had stolen my parents' identities as well as mine. Maybe it was a catastrophic clerical error at the county records office. But Marcus's voice echoed relentlessly in my head. 90 days past due. The bank had been sending delinquency notices for 3 months. Where were they? I religiously checked my mailbox. I had not received a single piece of mail, not one warning, regarding a mortgage or a loan. My billing address had to have been altered. My contact phone number had to have been hijacked and redirected. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow against my ribs. You do not accidentally divert someone's mail for a quarter of a year. You do not accidentally forge a power of attorney document. This was a calculated, deliberate ambush. I turned onto Maplewood Drive, the affluent, quiet street where my parents had lived for over 2 decades. The lawns were perfectly edged, vividly green despite the heat. The houses were sprawling, comfortable, and silent. I pulled up to the curb directly in front of their familiar colonial-style home. I slammed the gear shift into park and cut the engine. For a long moment, I just sat there. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned stark white against the dark leather. I forced myself to look at the property. The signs were there, glaring. Neon signs of sudden, inexplicable wealth that I had somehow missed or chosen to ignore during my last brief visit. Parked aggressively in the center of the driveway sat a heavy-duty pickup truck. It was shiny, black, and massive. The kind of vehicle that easily cost as much as a luxury sports car. It even had a giant, ridiculous red dealership bow still attached to the front grille. I turned my gaze toward the side gate. Through the wooden slats, I could see the backyard, a massive, custom-built cedar pergola, something my father had complained for years was far too expensive to ever install. Now stretched elegantly over the patio. Beneath it sat a gleaming, brand-new stainless steel outdoor kitchen setup. My eyes drifted back to the house itself. Through the front window, I could see the kitchen. The old Diet oak cabinets were gone. In their place were custom white shaker cabinets, gleaming quartz countertops, and a professional-grade gas range. It was all right there. The $200,000 was not a clerical error at all. It was parked in the driveway, built into the patio, and screwed into the kitchen walls. I unbuckled my seatbelt. The frantic, confusing shock that had carried me out of my office was entirely gone now. It had evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, diamond-hard clarity. I opened my car door and stepped out onto the hot pavement. I was ready to walk into the house I grew up in and rip every last lie out of it, room by room. I pushed the heavy oak front door open without knocking. The air conditioning hit my face, carrying the unfamiliar, sharp scent of newly cured polyurethane and the rich aroma of roasting beef. I stepped into the foyer and stopped dead. The photos did not do the renovation justice. The wall separating the dining room and the kitchen had been completely demolished. In its place stood an enormous waterfall-edge quartz island, bathed in the warm glow of brushed brass pendant lights. My mother, Maureen, was standing at a 6-burner industrial stove, stirring a pot. She wore a pristine linen blouse and a casual smile. She looked up, her expression entirely unbothered, as if my sudden appearance on a Wednesday afternoon was perfectly routine. "Kennedy, what a pleasant surprise," she chirped, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I am making pot roast. Are you staying for dinner?" "There is plenty." I ignored the question. I kept my voice flat and terrifyingly quiet. "Where did you get the money?" Maureen's smile did not falter, but her eyes flickered toward the sliding glass doors. "What a silly question. Your father has been saving. We decided it was finally time to update this old place. Sit down. Let me pour you a glass of wine." "Do not pour me anything," I snapped. "I saw the truck with the bow on the grill. I saw the pergola out back. I just got off the phone with the bank. Mom, where did you get the money?" The sliding glass door rattled open before she could answer. My father, Patrick, stepped inside, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at me, then at my mother, instantly reading the tension in the room. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed. "No need to interrogate your mother," Patrick said, walking over to the refrigerator and pulling out a bottle of water. "We leveraged an asset. The family needed an infusion of cash, and we used what was available to us." "You used my house," I stated. The words tasted like ash. "You took out a loan against property that you do not own." Patrick unscrewed the cap of his water bottle and took a long drink. "We temporarily borrowed some equity. It is not a big deal. We are going to pay it back. Families help each other. Kennedy, that is how the world works." I stared at the man who had raised me, feeling a profound, nauseating disconnect. He was speaking as if he had borrowed a lawnmower, not committed a massive financial crime. "You forged my signature," I said, my voice rising. "The bank said the documents were signed in person. How did you do it? How did you get a lender to hand over that kind of cash without me standing in the room?" Maureen stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "We did not forge anything, sweetheart. We used the power of attorney, the one you signed for us." My brain slammed into a brick wall. A memory surfaced, sharp and entirely out of context. 3 years ago, I had torn my anterior cruciate ligament skiing. I needed surgery, and I was going under general anesthesia. The hospital required an emergency medical proxy. I had signed a highly specific, strictly limited medical power of attorney giving my parents the right to make healthcare decisions if I ended up in a coma. "That was a medical proxy," I shouted, the restraint finally cracking. "For a knee surgery. 36 months ago, you used a hospital form to authorize a real estate transaction?" Patrick slammed his water bottle onto the quartz countertop. The sharp crack echoed through the cavernous new kitchen. "A legal document is a legal document. The broker said it was sufficient. Do not come into my house and start screaming about technicalities." "It is not a technicality. It is a felony," I fired back. "And what broker? No legitimate bank would accept a medical proxy for a property lien. Who helped you do this?" "Keep your voice down," my father warned, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. "You are being dramatic. The house needed fixing. The truck was dying, and your brother needed a lifeline." The air in the room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. I looked at my mother. She looked away, suddenly very interested in the simmering pot roast. "Declan," I breathed. The final, terrible piece of the puzzle slid into place. "How much did you give Declan?" Patrick crossed his arms, puffing out his chest. He had a foolproof opportunity, a sports bar franchise downtown. He needed the capital to secure the commercial lease and the liquor license. We are investors. When it takes off, he is going to pay off the entire loan. "A sports bar," I repeated, feeling genuinely dizzy. Declan cannot even manage a basic checking account. He got fired from his last bartending job for giving away free drinks, and you handed him my home equity? "It failed," Maureen blurted out, her voice trembling slightly. "The zoning board denied the permit, and the franchisor kept the non-refundable deposit. It was not his fault. Kennedy, the system was rigged against him." I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. They had stolen my financial security to fund a kitchen remodel, buy a luxury vehicle, and throw the rest into a black hole of my brother's chronic incompetence. "This is fraud," I said, my voice dropping back to that terrifying, flat tone. "This is identity theft, financial fraud, and forgery. You stole from me." That was the trigger. The carefully constructed facade of parental authority shattered. And my father went on the offensive. It was a tactical shift I had seen 1,000 times before. "How dare you?" Patrick roared, stepping toward me. "How dare you stand in the house I worked 30 years to pay for and call me a thief? I put clothes on your back. I paid for your braces. I paid for your college tuition. We sacrificed everything so you could sit in your fancy office and look down your nose at us. That has nothing to do with this," I yelled back. "It has everything to do with it," he bellowed. "You are cold, Kennedy. You have always been cold and ungrateful. You sit on your pile of cash while your own brother drowns. You could have helped him. You could have helped us. But no, you only care about yourself." Maureen moved to his side, placing a hand on his arm, presenting a united front of parental disappointment. Her eyes were wet with manufactured tears. "Your father is right," she said softly, her tone dripping with toxic victimhood. "You only ever care about hoarding your wealth. You never help the family in hard times. We had to do this. Kennedy, you left us no choice. If you had a shred of compassion, you would have offered to help Declan yourself." They were doing it again. They were taking their own massive, unforgivable transgression and twisting it until I was the villain. They wanted me to feel guilty for being violated, for a split second. The old, conditioned instinct to apologize, to smooth things over, to fix it, flared in my chest. Then I thought about the 90-day foreclosure warning. I thought about the 22-year-old version of myself, working double shifts to save for a down payment, eating rice and beans while Declan crashed another leased car. The instinct died, replaced by something much colder and far more permanent. I looked at the quartz countertops. I looked at the brand new stove. Then I looked my father directly in the eyes. I did not blink. "I am leaving now," I said. My voice was completely steady. "I am going to handle this strictly according to the law." Maureen gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Patrick's face twisted into an ugly, desperate snarl. "If you walk out that door," my father shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "If you make a big deal out of this and involve the authorities, we are done. Do you hear me? The whole family will never forgive you." I turned my back to them, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door, and pulled it open. "I know," I said. I walked out, letting the door slam shut behind me. Severing the tie forever, I slammed the car door shut and hit the physical lock button before my seatbelt was even fastened. The stifling heat of the closed cabin barely registered against my skin. I pulled out my phone, bypassed the standard customer service number I had called earlier, and found the direct hotline for the bank's fraud division. A representative named Sarah answered. I did not mince words or soften my tone. I stated my full name, my property address, and explicitly declared that the $200,000 encumbrance on my deed had been executed via forged documents. I demanded an immediate freeze on the account and requested a formal dispute be logged for suspected identity theft and unauthorized use of a legally void medical proxy. Sarah's tone shifted instantly from helpful customer service to clinical risk management. The typing on her end was rapid and heavy. She provided a claim number, 14 digits long, which I scribbled aggressively onto the back of a dry cleaning receipt using a pen from my center console. My next call was to Nora Whitfield. I had met Nora 2 years ago during a complex grant compliance audit at the Bureau. She specialized in civil litigation and corporate financial fraud. She was a pit bull in a tailored suit who viewed the legal code not as a shield, but as a weapon. She picked up on the third ring. I gave her the 60-second rundown of the afternoon's discoveries. The silence on her end was brief but heavy with calculation. Her first instruction was absolute. Cease all communication with your parents and your brother immediately. Nora ordered, her voice cutting sharply through my residual adrenaline. No angry text messages, no phone calls demanding further explanations. If they show up at your front door, you do not open it. You are officially in a hostile legal environment. Kennedy, we do not give them free ammunition while we build our strategy, I argued, just for a moment, that maybe I could simply scare my father into paying it off quickly, maybe force them to liquidate the truck and the new kitchen appliances. Nora shut that down with surgical precision. She explained the devastating reality of the banking system. If you try to handle this internally as a messy family dispute, the bank does not care, she warned. To the lender, this is a valid, delinquent loan. Unless we formally establish fraud on the public record with law enforcement and the courts, the bank will proceed with the foreclosure. They will take your house, sell it at auction, and your credit will be obliterated for 7 years. We do not negotiate with thieves. Kennedy, even if you share their DNA. Under Nora's direct supervision, my afternoon transformed into a blur of bureaucratic warfare. I drove straight to the precinct covering Ashford Grove and filed a preliminary report with the Wake County Financial Crimes Investigation Unit. The detective on duty, a weary-looking man named Hayes, took down my statement while I filled out a sworn affidavit, legally attesting under penalty of perjury that I had never applied for, authorized, or received the funds in question. He pulled up the initial bank inquiry on his terminal, and that was when the second gut punch of the day landed. Detective Hayes turned his monitor toward me, tapping the screen with a thick index finger. The primary contact information associated with the fraudulent loan was not mine. The phone number listed on the account was my mother's cell phone. The mailing address was not my home in Brook Hollow, but a post office box rented 2 towns over. The air rushed out of my lungs. This was the most damning piece of evidence yet. It completely destroyed my father's flimsy, arrogant defense of casually borrowing equity. Changing the contact details meant they had deliberately orchestrated a total communication blackout. They had intentionally intercepted the welcome packets, the monthly payment booklets, and the escalating delinquency notices. They had meticulously engineered a system to ensure I remained completely blind to the theft until the very last possible second. Presumably praying the doomed sports bar would magically generate profits before the bank seized my property. This was never an innocent mistake. It was predatory. It was predatory. It was a calculated, sustained deception by the woman who had packed my childhood lunches. I relayed this discovery to Nora from the precinct parking lot. She sounded almost pleased. "That is intent," she said sharply. "That is active concealment. Now, I need you to go home and build the armory." Nora laid out my homework. I needed to construct a microscopic, bulletproof timeline. She wanted the exact date of my knee surgery. She needed the physical copy of the original, restricted medical proxy. She demanded my timesheets and work schedules proving I was physically at the office and nowhere near the bank branch on the day the funds were dispersed. Most importantly, she wanted a comprehensive digital paper trail. Every text message, email, or voicemail where my parents had ever inquired about my house deed, and every historical instance where they had asked for money for Declan. I finally pulled into my own driveway just after 8 o'clock in the evening. The house was exactly as I had left it. Quiet, safe, and mine. But the feeling of passive security was gone, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. I did not bother turning on the television or making dinner. I brewed a pot of black coffee, sat at my dining room table, and opened my laptop. The digital clock in the corner of my screen read 12:14 in the morning when I right-clicked on my desktop. I selected the option for a new folder. I typed the word documentation and hit the enter key. For over a decade, my role in the Kelly family had been to absorb the damage, to quietly keep the peace, and to protect the fragile ecosystem of my parents' delusions regarding my brother. I stared at the empty yellow folder icon glowing brightly on the screen. The fear was entirely gone now. I was no longer interested in merely defending myself. I was going to dismantle them, piece by legal piece. The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in my dining room. As I clicked through years of archived emails and digital bank statements, the narrative of my life began to reassemble itself. This was not a sudden, unpredictable lightning strike of betrayal. It was the absolute, inevitable climax of a dynamic that had defined the Kelly household for over a decade. I was not just building a legal defense. I was excavating a crime scene that had been active for 15 years. I opened a blank spreadsheet and began logging the historical data. The columns were simple: date, amount, recipient, and stated purpose. Within 2 hours, the rows stretched down the screen in a damning, uninterrupted column of financial bleeding. There was the $1,200 I wired my parents to cover Declan's rent when he was evicted from his first apartment. There was the $3,500 emergency cash transfer to my father to cover legal retainer fees after my brother's second reckless driving charge. There were countless peer-to-peer transfers for $300 here, $500 there, always accompanied by a frantic, tearful phone call from my mother about Declan needing a bridge until his next imaginary paycheck. Out of 22 recorded transactions spanning 8 years, exactly 2 had ever been partially repaid. My parents used to tease me relentlessly about my budgeting software. During Thanksgiving dinners, my father would proudly tell the extended family that I lived my life like a depressed accountant. He would laugh, swirling his bourbon, and say I lacked the entrepreneurial spirit, that I was too obsessed with pennies to understand the big picture. Maureen would chime in, sighing that I was just naturally rigid, unlike my brother, whose chaotic failures were perpetually rebranded as a free-spirited, artistic temperament. The bitter, suffocating irony tasted like copper on my tongue. The exact meticulous nature they had mocked for years was now the very foundation of my legal strategy. My compulsive record-keeping was going to bury them. As I scrolled back through the years, the financial entries triggered memories I had purposefully buried under layers of forced familial obligation. I found the bank transfer dated on my 25th birthday. We were supposed to go to a nice steakhouse downtown to celebrate. Instead, my mother called me crying at 4 in the afternoon because Declan had been arrested for public intoxication and needed bail money. I spent my birthday evening sitting in a plastic chair in a municipal holding facility, paying his fine with my savings, while my parents coddled him and told him the police had simply overreacted. I found an email thread from the week I received my promotion to senior grant analyst. I had invited my parents over to celebrate. Maureen canceled 30 minutes before they were supposed to arrive because Declan was having a crisis of confidence after walking out on a landscaping job, and he needed them to take him to dinner to cheer him up. Every milestone I achieved was a threat to Declan's fragile ego, and so my parents simply erased my accomplishments to maintain his spotlight. I was the designated survivor, the golden child's permanent shock absorber, but I was not entirely compliant, and I needed to prove to Nora and the investigators that I had a documented history of establishing financial boundaries. I searched my outbox for Declan's name and the word guarantor. It took less than 10 minutes to find the email thread from 4 years ago. My father had explicitly asked me to co-sign a high-interest auto loan for a used sports car Declan wanted. My response was polite but absolute. I wrote clearly that I would not put my name on any debt obligation for my brother, nor would I ever guarantee a loan for him under any circumstances. I saved the email as a portable document format file and dragged it into the documentation folder. It was a perfect, glaring contradiction to their inevitable narrative that I would casually hand over my largest asset for his failed business venture. Then, I started searching through my text message history with my mother. Nora had asked about any subtle inquiries regarding my property. I scrolled back through months of mundane conversations about the weather and recipe links until I hit a block of texts from last November. We had been discussing a neighbor who had recently downsized their home. Tucked casually into the conversation was a message from Maureen. She wrote that it was such a shame to let all that equity just sit there doing nothing. She said smart families leverage their assets to create generational wealth. I had ignored the text at the time, brushing it off as her parroting some daytime television financial guru. Reading it now, the screen felt radioactive. It was undeniable premeditation. The seed had been planted at least 8 months ago, They had been sizing up my house like a bank vault waiting to be cracked. For years, I had carried the suffocating weight of self-doubt. In the Kelly family ecosystem, to resist was to be unfilial. If I questioned where my money went, I was selfish. If I expressed anger over Declan's ruined promises, I was lacking empathy. The cycle of manipulation was so complete, so perfectly engineered, that I always ended up apologizing for being upset. They had conditioned me to believe that my boundaries were character flaws. I had stayed quiet for so long because fighting back meant acknowledging that the people who were supposed to protect me were actively feeding off me. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my burning eyes. The digital clock on the stove read 3:45 in the morning. I was exhausted, but the crushing, confusing weight of betrayal had completely vanished. I stopped asking myself how a mother and father could do this to their own daughter. The psychological question of why they did it no longer mattered. They did it because I was convenient, and because they believed I would simply take the hit, just like I always had. The grieving period for the family I thought I had was officially over. I closed my eyes and let the remaining affection I held for them wither and die in the dark. I opened my eyes, looked at the growing list of evidence in my folder, and asked myself the only question that mattered now. What exactly do I need to prove tomorrow so that no one can ever twist the truth against me again? The preliminary discovery phase felt less like a legal proceeding and more like an autopsy. 2 weeks after I filed the initial fraud report, the bank's legal department begrudgingly complied with Nora's subpoena for the original loan file. We sat in her downtown conference room, the heavy mahogany table completely covered in printed documents. The application was a masterclass in sloppy, arrogant forgery. My supposed signature on the final authorization page was jagged and hesitant, completely lacking the fluid, rapid loop of my actual handwriting. It looked exactly like what it was. Someone slowly tracing my name while staring at an old birthday card. The notary seal stamped next to it was the wrong dimensional format for our jurisdiction. A cheap custom stamp ordered online rather than a state-issued credential. But the most glaring, undeniable piece of evidence was the power of attorney itself. They had indeed used the medical proxy I signed 3 years prior, but they had simply omitted page 2 when they ran it through the scanner. That missing page was the specific addendum that explicitly restricted their authority exclusively to healthcare decisions during surgical incapacitation. Nora slid a tablet across the table and hit play. The bank had handed over the interior security footage from the local branch. The timestamp in the corner read 2:14 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I watched my mother and father stroll up to the loan officer's desk. I was nowhere in the frame, directly contradicting the digital log that claimed all signatories were physically present, but they were not alone. A man wearing a cheap gray suit and carrying a battered leather briefcase sat down right next to them. I pointed at the screen. "Who is that?" Nora smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. "That is a local document broker. He advertises his consulting services on late-night television, specifically targeting individuals who have trouble proving their income to traditional lenders. He is a professional ghost. Kennedy, it seems your parents did not just walk in and hope for the best. They hired a facilitator to grease the wheels." This revelation fundamentally changed the landscape of our case. This was no longer just a desperate, impulsive family transgression. It was an organized conspiracy involving a third-party accessory. The forensic accounting report tracked the money with brutal clarity. Once the funds cleared, the entire $200,000 vanished in exactly 72 hours. The money splintered off in 4 distinct directions. A massive chunk went directly to the general contractor handling the kitchen remodel. Another wire transfer hit a commercial real estate escrow account, covering the non-refundable franchise deposit for Declan's doomed sports bar. A cashier's check was cut to a high-end auto dealership to cover the pickup truck sitting in their driveway. But the fourth transaction was a new, revolting discovery. $45,000 had been wired to an out-of-state collection agency to settle an aggressive, long-standing gambling debt Declan had managed to hide from everyone. They had literally mortgaged my future to cover his secret. Catastrophic bets. while reviewing county tax records to trace the contractor liens. Nora uncovered another detail my parents had carefully buried. They had quietly pulled a pre-listing inspection permit for their own property just days before executing the fraudulent loan. They were actively preparing to put their house on the market and purchase a significantly smaller townhouse on the other side of the county. The sheer malice of their overall strategy snapped into perfect, horrifying focus. They wanted to liquidate their own home to pad their retirement accounts. But before they restructured their assets, they decided to extract every available drop of cash from my property to handle Declan's mess and upgrade their own lifestyle. They were fiercely protecting their own nest egg by burning mine to the ground. The definitive kill shot for our case arrived on a Thursday morning. Nora had aggressively blanketed every contractor who worked on my parents' house with strict document subpoenas. The landscaper who built the backyard pergola complied immediately, handing over his entire digital communication log to avoid being dragged into the lawsuit. Included in his file was a saved voicemail from my father regarding a minor billing discrepancy. Nora played the audio file on the speakerphone in her office. The room filled with my father's arrogant, booming voice. "Just run the card for the extra lumber," he commanded through the static of the recording. "Do not worry about the name on the account. My daughter does not pay attention to paperwork anyway. She will never even notice." I felt the blood rush to my ears. It was pure, undeniable criminal intent recorded in high definition. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he viewed my supposed ignorance as his personal blank check. The moment Nora forwarded that audio clip and the identity of the shady broker to the bank's corporate legal department, their aggressive, defensive posture completely collapsed. For weeks, they had been trying to brush us off, insisting the loan was legally binding and proceeding with the foreclosure timeline. Now, they were staring down the barrel of a massive institutional negligence lawsuit. Their branch manager had accepted a mutilated medical document, facilitated by a known predatory broker, to authorize a six-figure real estate lien against an absent property owner. The bank's lead counsel abruptly shifted tactics, practically begging Nora to hold off on notifying the federal banking regulators and offering full internal cooperation to reverse the fraud and clear my title. The momentum was entirely on our side. We had the forged documents, the security video, the financial trail, the secret real estate plot, and the audio confession. I was packing up my briefcase, feeling the first genuine wave of relief I had experienced in a month, when Nora's desk phone rang. She answered, listened intently for a long moment, and her expression hardened into a mask of pure, rigid granite. She hung up the receiver and looked across the table at me, her eyes dead serious. "That was opposing counsel," Nora said, her voice dropping into a tight, urgent register. "Your parents just retained a major defense firm. They are not retreating, Kennedy. They are preparing to fight, and they are about to launch a completely fabricated narrative to place the blame entirely on you." The letter arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday. Nora slid the heavy, cream-colored paper across her mahogany desk. It was drafted by a senior partner at a boutique defense firm, and the legal fiction it contained was breathtaking. According to their narrative, I had explicitly given my parents verbal consent to use my property as collateral during a family meeting last Christmas. The letter boldly claimed that I had only recently changed my mind and decided to weaponize the legal system because of a petty, long-standing personal conflict with my brother. They were framing my stolen equity as a simple sibling rivalry over a business loan gone wrong. Nora tapped a silver pen against the desk. She instructed me to maintain absolute silence on all voice channels. There would be no more phone calls, no more heated arguments, and absolutely no defensive explanations. From this moment forward, every single interaction had to be a calculated text message or an email. We needed them to feel confident. We needed them to talk. And more importantly, we needed them to type. Sitting in my car later that afternoon, I drafted a text message to my father. I stripped out every ounce of anger, betrayal, and emotion. I made it sound like a cold, administrative inquiry. I typed, "Please list exactly what amount was used for what and who decided. I hit send and waited. I knew my father's ego. He hated being questioned. But he hated being ignored even more. He viewed himself as the patriarch, the ultimate authority on all family matters. It took exactly 14 minutes for him to take the bait. His reply was a massive block of text, practically vibrating with indignation. He proudly detailed the kitchen remodel costs and the commercial lease deposit. But the final sentence was the golden ticket. He wrote, "I made the call because I have the parental right to manage our family resources, and you should be grateful I took the initiative." I took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to Nora. My father had just explicitly admitted, in writing, to unilateral decision-making over funds legally attached to my name, entirely destroying his own lawyer's defense of mutual verbal consent. When the aggressive intimidation failed, my mother deployed her specialty. The voicemails started pouring in over the weekend. Maureen sobbed into the receiver, begging me to reconsider. She spun a tragic tale about how this sports bar was Declan's final chance to turn his life around, how he was finally showing maturity, and how my legal actions were going to destroy his spirit forever. A year ago, the sound of my mother crying would have sent me into a panic. Now, I simply saved the audio files directly into my secure folder. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. I was documenting their manipulation in real time. Realizing that I was no longer responding to their private pressure, they took the war public. By the middle of the week, the smear campaign was in full swing. My phone lit up with messages from extended relatives and members of my parents' local church congregation. An aunt accused me of elder abuse, claiming I was suing my aging parents for money they desperately needed. A cousin left a scathing voicemail saying I was a monster for trying to put my own brother out on the street over a simple misunderstanding. They were painting a masterpiece of martyrdom, portraying themselves as the devoted, generous parents under attack by a greedy, ruthless daughter. The urge to defend myself, to post the forged documents online and scream the truth to everyone, was nearly overwhelming. But Nora held me back. We were playing chess, not engaging in a street brawl. Instead of wasting energy on a public relations battle with people who were committed to misunderstanding me, we struck where it actually hurt. Nora and I filed an emergency petition for an injunction in civil court. We requested a hard legal freeze on all physical assets purchased with the disputed funds. Within 48 hours, a judge signed the order. My parents were legally barred from selling, transferring, or hiding the new pickup truck. The commercial restaurant equipment Declan had purchased was locked down in a warehouse. We cut off their escape route. They could no longer liquidate the stolen money to hire better lawyers or hide the cash in offshore accounts. The reality of the freeze must have hit them hard, because the dynamic shifted violently in the middle of the night. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen illuminated the dark bedroom. It was a text message from Declan. He did not apologize. He did not ask how I was doing. His message was frantic and poorly spelled. He asked if I would be willing to drop the legal charges if he agreed to pay me back in monthly installments out of his own pocket. I sat up in bed, reading the words over and over. The implication was massive. If he truly believed, as my parents' lawyer claimed, that I had given verbal consent for the loan, he would have no reason to offer a secret. Desperate repayment plan to avoid legal charges. His message proved that he knew exactly what they had done. He knew it was an unauthorized, illegal extraction of my assets, and he knew he was holding stolen property. I did not reply. I took a screenshot and sent it to Nora. I stared at the ceiling as the adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by a sharp, clear strategic vision. My parents would never break. They were too deeply entrenched in their own delusional narrative of parental sacrifice and entitlement. They would lie on the stand until they were blue in the face, but Declan was different. Declan was soft. He was a coward who had spent his entire life hiding behind my parents' checkbook. Now, the bar was frozen, the truck was locked down, and the protective bubble our parents had built around him was collapsing under the weight of a felony investigation. The weakest link in their defense was not the forged paperwork or the shady broker. The weakest link was my brother, and he was absolutely terrified of going to prison. The The State Financial Fraud Prosecution Bureau officially opened a criminal docket on a Tuesday morning, the mountain of evidence Nora and I had compiled. The bank's internal panic, the forged signatures, and the undeniable flow of stolen money finally triggered the state apparatus. This was no longer a civil dispute over property rights. It was a felony investigation. I was summoned to the prosecutor's office in downtown Raleigh for an exhaustive interview. I sat in a sterile, windowless room with fluorescent lighting for 4 straight hours. The lead investigator, a sharp, unsmiling woman named Vance, guided me through my entire financial history with my family. I knew what defense my parents would try to mount in a criminal trial. They would paint me as a hostile, estranged daughter completely out of touch with family dynamics, instead of trying to present myself as a flawless, untouchable victim. I laid out the ugly, complicated truth. I meticulously detailed every single time I had willingly given them money in the past. I told Vance about paying Declan's rent for 6 months straight. I documented the legal fees I covered for his previous arrests. I explained how I had willingly acted as the family's emergency fund for over a decade. I did not hide the fact that I loved them and had tried to save them from themselves multiple times. Vance stopped typing and looked at me over her glasses. By admitting to a long history of financial support, I had inadvertently destroyed my parents' best defense. A jury would see that I was not a heartless daughter who refused to help. I was a dutiful daughter who had finally drawn a hard line, a line they chose to illegally cross. My honesty made my claim that this specific transaction was unauthorized entirely bulletproof. 2 days later, the facade of family loyalty cracked from an unexpected direction. My father's sister, Aunt Irene, sent me a highly secretive text message asking to meet at a diner on the outskirts of town. I had not spoken to Irene since the smear campaign began. When I slid into the vinyl booth across from her, she looked exhausted. She stirred her black coffee for a long time before she spoke. Irene confessed that she could not sleep. 3 weeks prior to my discovery of the loan, she had attended a backyard barbecue at my parents' house. After a few glasses of wine, my father had loudly bragged to a group of relatives that they were using the girls' house as capital to fund the new kitchen and the sports bar. Irene admitted she had felt something was deeply wrong, but in the Kelly family, no one dared question my father's authority. Then she leaned across the table and delivered a piece of information that made the hair on my arms stand up. Irene told me that later that same afternoon. My mother had pulled her aside into the hallway. Maureen had asked Irene, who worked as a receptionist at a medical clinic, a very specific question. She had asked if a medical power of attorney could be legally enforced at a commercial bank. I thanked Irene, paid for the coffee, and immediately called Nora. My mother's question to my aunt proved absolute, terrifying premeditation. They had not been confused by the legal paperwork. They knew exactly what the document was meant for, and they actively sought confirmation on whether they could successfully weaponize it outside of a hospital setting. As the criminal case gathered momentum in the shadows, the social warfare in the daylight became suffocating. The community pressure campaign intensified. My voicemail filled with furious messages from people I had known since childhood. A prominent member of our church called me a traitor daughter, accusing me of abandoning Christian forgiveness to destroy my own flesh and blood. They were certain I was driving my elderly parents into destitution. This psychological siege happened to align perfectly with the most stressful period of my professional life. The Southeastern Community Grant Review Bureau was undergoing its mandatory biennial compliance audit. Every day, I put on a tailored blazer, walked into the office at 8 in the morning, and spent 9 hours meticulously reviewing municipal funding allocations, cross-referencing ledger entries, and ensuring millions of taxpayer dollars were flawlessly accounted for. The contrast was agonizing. In my cubicle, I was a pillar of order, structure, and absolute integrity. The moment I stepped into my car at 5 in the evening, I was plunged back into a chaotic, vicious war zone of familial betrayal. I compartmentalized the trauma because breaking down was not an option. I answered emails with total professionalism, while simultaneously reading text messages from cousins wishing I would burn in hell. The discipline required to maintain my composure felt like holding my breath underwater for days on end. On Friday afternoon, Prosecutor Vance requested an urgent video conference with Nora and me. When her face appeared on the screen, her expression was grim. She informed us that her office had run a comprehensive background sweep of my Social Security number across all financial institutions, looking for any other anomalies. They found one. Vance revealed that 3 days after successfully extracting the initial $200,000 against my house, my parents had visited a completely different regional credit union. Using the exact same forged medical proxy and the same photocopies of my identification, they had attempted to open an unsecured personal line of credit for $50,000. The application had ultimately been flagged and denied by the credit union's automated underwriting system due to an address mismatch, but the attempt itself was a devastating revelation. This was not a one-time act of desperation to save my brother. This was an active, ongoing enterprise. They had tasted the success of the first theft and immediately went back for more. They were planning to drain my identity dry. Nora did not say a word. She just nodded slowly at the screen. Vance looked directly into the camera and told us that based on the testimony from Aunt Irene and the newly discovered attempted credit application, a Superior Court judge had just reviewed the evidence. The judge had officially signed a search warrant for my parents' property. The state police were scheduled to execute the raid at dawn. The quiet, polite dispute over a family misunderstanding was officially dead. The true nightmare for Patrick and Maureen Kelly was about to begin. Investigator Vance called me at 9 in the morning on a Thursday. The state police had executed the search warrant at the Ashford Grove property just after dawn. They bypassed the new kitchen and went straight for my father's home office. They found a fireproof lockbox shoved into the darkest corner of his closet. Inside was a meticulous, horrifyingly organized master file of their crime. There were high-resolution color scans of my passport, my driver's license, and my original property deed. Worse, there was a handwritten ledger. My father had literally accounted for every single stolen dollar. He had specific columns dedicated to the custom cabinets, the black pickup truck, and a distinct section titled with my brother's name, detailing the exact payouts to various local bookies. But the most sickening piece of evidence came from my mother's bedside table. Vance emailed Nora a scanned copy of a yellow legal pad. It was a draft of a letter Maureen had been actively workshopping. If their mail interception scheme failed, and the bank contacted me before they could sell their own house and vanish, she was going to send this letter. The draft outlined a completely fabricated, terminal medical crisis. She had written out a script claiming Patrick had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive cardiac condition, and the loan was a desperate, last-minute measure to pay for experimental surgery. She was fully prepared to fake a dying husband to guilt me into dropping any investigation. Then came my brother. Detectives picked Declan up outside his apartment building that same afternoon. In the sterile interrogation room, his immediate instinct was self-preservation. He cried. He swore up and down that our parents had handled all the finances, that he was just a clueless beneficiary who thought they had tapped into their retirement savings to help him start his business. Vance let him spin his web of victimhood for 20 minutes before she dropped a heavy manila folder onto the metal table. Inside was the commercial franchise agreement for the sports bar. It clearly detailed the origin of the escrow funds, and right at the bottom, bearing my brother's signature and a notary stamp, was a clause confirming his direct receipt and knowledge of the asset transfer. He shattered immediately. Declan traded our parents for leniency without a second thought. He confessed that they had all sat around the new quartz island and discussed the risk. When Declan asked what would happen when I eventually found out about the massive lien on my property, my mother had laughed. Declan quoted her word for word to the police. She had said, "Kennedy will throw a fit and cry about it for a few months, but she will end up paying the monthly payment. She always cleans up the mess. They never had any intention of paying the bank back. They had fully intended for me to carry that financial anchor for the next 30 years. 3 weeks later, we faced them in a civil deposition. The criminal case was building rapidly. but the civil suit to clear my title and freeze their assets was moving concurrently. We sat in a freezing conference room in a high-rise downtown. My parents sat across the long, polished table. They did not look like cornered criminals facing felony indictments. They looked like indignant royalty. Under oath, my father doubled down on his horrifying worldview. He looked the stenographer dead in the eye and stated for the official record that he had a fundamental, parental right to manage the resources of his family as he saw fit. My mother dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue, staring directly at me with a look of absolute disgust. She testified that I had been intensely selfish since I was a little girl, that I hoarded my allowance while my brother went without, and that forcing this legal issue was just a continuation of my lifelong cruelty. The urge to lunge across the mahogany table and wrap my hands around her throat was blinding. My chest heaved, and my vision went dark at the edges. But Nora kicked my ankle sharply under the table. I clamped my jaw shut. I tasted copper. I stayed completely silent and let Nora do the dissecting. She ignored their emotional theater and began walking them through the timeline, trapping them in the glaring contradictions between their claims of temporary family borrowing and their secret real estate listing intended to hide their own assets. We were winning. The defense was visibly crumbling under Nora's relentless questioning. Then, their lead attorney, a slick man with a very expensive suit, opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table. It was a printed email. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was from an exchange I had with my parents 4 years ago, back when they were having their roof replaced, and the contractor needed an easement signed for the property line. The attorney had highlighted one specific sentence I had typed at the end of a long paragraph. It read, "If you need me to help with the house papers, just let me know in advance." Nora stared at the paper. She immediately called for a 15-minute recess. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into the empty hallway, the heavy wooden door shutting solidly behind us. Her face was pale. She held up the piece of paper, her voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. "This is a massive problem," Nora said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Context is everything to us, but to a jury of 12 strangers, this is a nightmare. It is entirely ambiguous, if their lawyer spins this right. That one sentence could completely dilute the element of non-consent. It could turn a coordinated felony fraud conviction into a messy family misunderstanding." The mahogany walls of the Wake County Courthouse felt like the inside of a pressure cooker. The criminal trial began on a rainy Tuesday morning, and the defense immediately launched their meticulously crafted narrative. Their lead attorney, a theatrical man named Sterling, spent his opening statement painting my parents as technologically illiterate, aging victims of a confusing financial system. He cast me as the wealthy, hyper-independent, and entirely ruthless daughter who was using a minor familial misunderstanding to exact brutal revenge for petty childhood grievances. When I was called to the witness stand, the air in the room turned brittle. Sterling paced in front of the jury box, holding the single piece of paper he had unveiled during the civil depositions weeks earlier. He slapped the printed email onto the wooden ledge in front of me. He read the isolated sentence aloud, his voice booming with manufactured indignation, highlighting my offer to help with the house papers. He leaned in close, demanding I admit to the 12 jurors that I had previously opened the door for my parents to utilize my property documents. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of absolute calm. I did not raise my voice. I looked directly at the jury and explained the actual context. I stated clearly that the email was sent 4 years ago when my parents were dealing with a predatory roofing contractor. I had offered to read over their property line easements and repair contracts. I had never, at any point in my life, offered to let them leverage my home for cash. Sterling scoffed, attempting to wave away my explanation, but he had walked right into the trap Nora and Prosecutor Vance had prepared. On redirect examination, Vance approached the stand. She did not bring a single sheet of paper. She brought a blown-up, poster-sized display board. It was the complete email thread, printed with verified digital metadata showing the exact date, time, and server origin. She asked me to read the sentence immediately following the one Sterling had isolated. I leaned into the microphone. My voice echoed sharply across the quiet courtroom. I wrote, and I quote, "However, to be absolutely clear, I am not co-signing any agreements, nor am I using my house as collateral for any loans under any circumstances." A palpable shift rippled through the jury box. Several jurors visibly frowned, turning their glares toward the defense table. Sterling's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. The deliberate omission of that second sentence destroyed their entire narrative of implied consent. It proved I had explicitly forbidden the exact crime they had committed. From there, Vance methodically dismantled whatever remained of my parents' defense. She was surgical. She introduced the high-definition security footage from the bank branch, clearly showing the professional document broker sliding the paperwork to my parents. She brought in a state verification expert who testified that the notary seal was a cheap, mail-order fake. Then, Vance played the audio recording of my father's voicemail to the landscaper, hearing his arrogant, dismissive voice echo through the courtroom, bragging that his daughter would never notice the missing money. Completely eradicated the image of a confused, helpless old man. It was the sound of calculated, predatory entitlement. The emotional peak of the trial arrived on Thursday afternoon when Aunt Irene took the stand. She looked fragile, her hands trembling as she adjusted her glasses. Testifying against her own brother was visibly tearing her apart, making every word she spoke carry a devastating weight, under oath. Irene recounted the backyard barbecue. She looked down at her lap, her voice wavering. As she confirmed that Maureen had pulled her aside into a hallway, Irene testified that my mother had specifically asked how someone might use a restricted medical proxy at a commercial bank. My mother sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, refusing to make eye contact with her sister. Irene's testimony was the final nail in the coffin of their ignorance defense. It proved absolute, undeniable premeditation. But the prosecution had saved the most volatile element for last. On Friday morning, Declan was called as a hostile witness. The protective bubble our parents had spent 3 decades inflating around him was completely gone. He looked terrified, sweating through the collar of his dress shirt. Sterling tried to guide him, trying to establish that Declan was just an innocent bystander who believed the funds came from our parents' legitimate retirement savings. Declan nodded along frantically, gripping the edges of the witness box, but under cross-examination. Vance applied the pressure. She rapidly fired questions about the timeline, the franchise agreements, and the sudden influx of cash to pay off his illicit gambling debts. Declan started to hyperventilate. His answers grew defensive, tangled, and contradictory. Vance stepped closer, holding up the commercial lease deposit receipt, and asked him point-blank why he never questioned receiving a 6-figure sum 48 hours after a secret family meeting. Declan cracked, his voice pitched up into a panicked whine. "I did not force them to do it," he shouted, tears springing to his eyes. "They told me they were pulling the money from Kennedy's house equity. I knew where it came from before I bought the restaurant equipment, but they said she would just pay it off. It was their idea." The courtroom erupted into a low roar of overlapping gasps and murmurs. The judge struck his gavel heavily against the sounding block. Demanding order, Declan slumped forward in his seat, sobbing openly into his hands, having just confessed on the public record to knowingly receiving and spending stolen property. My parents sat perfectly still, their faces drained of all color, their golden child, the son they had committed multiple felonies to protect, had just sold them out entirely to save his own skin. Hours later, the closing arguments concluded. The judge read the final instructions to the jury regarding the charges of felony financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The bailiff opened the heavy side door, and the 12 jurors filed out of the room to begin their deliberations. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, plunging the courtroom into a strange, ringing silence. Nora placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, but I barely felt it. I sat perfectly motionless in the wooden gallery pew. My hands gripped the edge of the seat so tightly my knuckles ached. Every single piece of evidence had been presented, Every ugly, undeniable truth about my family had been dragged into the light. I had done everything perfectly. But as I stared at the empty jury box, the terrifying reality settled over me. The final outcome was no longer in my hands. The jury deliberated for exactly 9 hours and 14 minutes. When the 12 men and women finally filed back into the Wake County courtroom, the air felt thick enough to choke on. I stood up, Nora right beside me. As the foreman handed the folded slip of paper to the bailiff, the judge adjusted his glasses and read the verdict aloud. Guilty on all counts of felony financial fraud, guilty of aggravated identity theft, guilty of conspiracy to commit forgery. I did not cry. There was no dramatic breakdown, no sudden burst of tears. Instead, I let out a long, slow breath, feeling an immense, crushing weight lift off my chest. It felt exactly like stepping out of a dark, windowless room and breathing fresh air for the very first time in my life. The court moved swiftly into the restitution phase. The judge was merciless. He ordered the immediate seizure and public auction of the black pickup truck and all the commercial restaurant equipment sitting in Declan's rented warehouse. Because the kitchen remodel was permanently attached to my parents' property, the court slapped a massive judicial lien on their house. They would not see a single dime of profit when they eventually sold it. Every cent would be routed directly back to the defrauded institutions. More importantly, armed with the criminal conviction, the bank's corporate legal team officially dissolved the fraudulent $200,000 loan attached to my name. They purged the delinquency status and erased the foreclosure warning from my property title and credit history entirely. My house was officially, undeniably mine again. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. This was when Prosecutor Vance delivered the final, devastating blow to my parents' remaining shred of dignity. She formally submitted the evidence of their second, failed attempt to open a $50,000 line of credit at the regional credit union using my stolen identity. She presented it to the judge as an aggravating factor, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was not a one-time act of desperate panic to save their son. It was the beginning of a calculated, systematic campaign to drain my financial existence dry. Given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, my parents showed their true colors one last time, standing before the judge in standard-issue county jumpsuits. They offered absolutely no remorse. Patrick stared at me with pure venom, stating for the official court record that their family was destroyed today not because of what they did, but because I had coldly chosen money over my own flesh and blood. Maureen wept loudly, nodding along with him, playing the tragic martyr until the very second the bailiff led them away. They were fundamentally incapable of taking accountability. It cemented my resolve. There was nothing left to mourn. That evening, as I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot, my phone vibrated. It was a massive block of text from Declan. He had avoided jail time by turning state's evidence, but he was facing total financial ruin. His message was a frantic, pathetic plea asking for one last financial favor to help him avoid personal bankruptcy. He promised he would change. He promised he would pay me back. A year ago, that message would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and anxiety. Today, I simply took a screenshot. I dragged the image file into my secure legal folder. Then, I opened my contacts, selected my brother's number, and pressed block. I did not type a single word in response. It was a tiny, silent action, but it was the absolute climax of my liberation. The decades-long cycle of abuse and enabling was officially severed. I drove back to my house in the Brook Hollow neighborhood. I walked through the front door, locked the deadbolt, and stepped into my living room. I sat down on my sofa. For the first time in my entire adult life, I did not feel the need to keep one eye on my phone. I was not bracing for a manufactured crisis. I was not waiting for an emergency demand for cash. The house was completely silent, and for the first time, that silence felt entirely safe. 6 months later, I stood at the head of the main conference room at the Southeastern Community Grant Review Bureau. We were conducting an internal training seminar for our junior analysts on recognizing the subtle indicators of financial exploitation. I clicked the presentation remote, advancing to a slide detailing the statistical rise in familial identity theft. I looked out at the room full of young professionals taking notes. I did not tell them my personal story. I kept my voice measured, professional, and authoritative. But every single word I spoke was rooted in the absolute, hard-won truth of my survival. I told them that proximity does not equal safety. I explained that the most dangerous financial predators rarely wear ski masks. They often have keys to your front door and know your middle name. And as I wrapped up the seminar, I looked directly at the crowd and delivered the final lesson. Sharing blood with someone does not give them the right to steal your life. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.